Madrid fails to remember that Catalan self-government is not born from the Spanish Constitution, but predates it by more than 600 years. It is no coincidence at all that during the last century, 9 out of the 11 Catalan presidents have been banned from office, lived through exile, detained, imprisoned, or executed. Coming back to our present day, Madrid needs to recognize that pro-independence forces won the election that Rajoy himself called. Madrid's illegitimate rule of Catalonia must end. If the Catalan people cannot choose the government of the Catalan people, then it means that there is no democracy in Catalonia. It means that voting in elections is useless. This is an idea that we will never, ever accept. And I hope you neither do. Because what is at stake here is the ideal of democracy in the whole of Europe, not only in my country. On December 21, the Catalan people sent a message to Europe and the world. We will not surrender to authoritarianism. Despite Madrid's threats, soon we will form a new government. And it is time to negotiate. It is time to end the repression and find a political solution for Catalonia. No a penal solution, a political one for Catalonia. I hope that one day, not far away from today, the will of our people will prevail and will be able to create a successful new state that will become as admired as Denmark is today. In democracy we trust, in European values we believe, and the Catalan people will persist. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Puigdemont. You are really good at this, actually, but let's quiet down a bit. Well, thank you very much. Of course, one thing which is also a characteristic of small countries is that we flatter easily. So thank you very much for all the nice things about Denmark. I'm sure that there will be people in Madrid and elsewhere who would like to challenge your certain account of events, but that particular expertise is unfortunately not something we have in our department. I would love a section on Catalan politics, but unfortunately we don't have those qualifications. But what we do have is world-leading competences on the European Union and on democracy and that way of democratic compromise. So what I would suggest is that my colleagues, Professor Marlene Wind and Christian Rosbøl, will make their interventions, then you will have the opportunity to reply, and then if anyone is still standing in this rather hot room, then we can go for some Q&A.
Du starter til Mikkels mig.
And you are obviously having a little discussion on who goes first over there?
You told me Christian was going first.
Well, in that case, Christian goes first.
Okay, thank you. This event is a very controversial event. Many have protested against it. Let me therefore emphasize that I'm not contributing here as a partisan or as a politician. I'm standing here in front of you as an academic and a political theorist. The issue we discuss here concerns democracy and drawing of borders or political units. This is, from my perspective as a democratic theorist, a very interesting and complex issue, and I shall explain why in a minute. First, however, I want to insist that this is an issue about which there can be reasonable disagreement. Not all political disagreements are reasonable from my perspective. Only those positions which accept fundamental principles of human equality are reasonable. Thus, for example, racism or pro-slavery are not reasonable views. But when it comes to the issue of the right to national self-determination and secession, I think we are within the bounds of reasonable disagreement. Reasonable disagreements does not mean that both sides are equally right, but only that both sides are committed to fundamental principles of human rights and democracy. We simply disagree on the meaning and implications of these principles. So I speak here from the perspective of my academic expertise, which is political theory and philosophy, as well as democratic theory. I'm interested in viewing the Catalan conflict from the perspective of fundamental principles of liberal democracy. It is not straightforward, I want to emphasize, what these principles mean in practice. There are no algorithms or easy answers that we just put up our principles and then we will have a solution to complex issues like this. Mr. Puigdemont has said in an article in The Guardian, all we want is to carry out the greatest expression of a free democracy and vote on Catalonia's future. Let me therefore ask, when can we call a decision democratic? Many of you might say that a decision is democratic when the people made it. Others might say that since the people are never in complete agreement, that consensus is impossible, a decision is democratic when a majority voted in favor of it. However, this suggestion, the suggestion that a decision can be democratic, to be democratic must be made by the people, or at least a majority of the people, raises a prior question, namely, which people should make the decision, or the majority of which people should make the decision. In political theory, we call this question the boundary problem, or the problem of constituting the demos. Unless we have a global democracy, democracy depends on borders. It depends on defining who belongs to the people, that has a right to rule itself. One cannot say that democracy is more important than borders, because there is no democracy without borders. There is no democracy without a delimited demos. The boundary problem, or the problem of constituting the demos, is this. Before we can make a democratic vote, we must decide who belongs to the demos who can vote. We cannot vote about who should be allowed to vote without ending in an infinite regress. For who should decide who should be allowed to vote about who should be allowed to vote? In the case at hand, Catalan separatists take it for granted that Catalans constitute the appropriate demos, while the Spanish government takes it for granted that all Spanish citizens constitute the legitimate demos. The weakness of the idea that Catalans have a right to determine their own future is that this takes the truth of the proposition that Catalans are the appropriate demos to decide the issue for given, but this is exactly the issue of dispute. Similarly, the proposition that all Spanish citizens or their representatives have the right to decide takes it for given that the latter are the demos who should decide. Thus, the democratic self-determination argument suffers from a symmetry problem. It can equally be invoked by both sides. Both sides can say the people should decide. They simply disagree on who the people are, that is, which people should decide. Does the democratic self-determination argument imply that any group, region, or city has the right to secede or create its own country? Would Barcelona or Valderrama be allowed to leave an independent Catalonia? It seems to me that self-determination arguments are never only, or the only premise is never just the people should decide for themselves. There's always another argument at play concerning whom counts as a people. And this argument is not an argument from democracy. Earlier I said that a democratic decision to be democratic must follow a democratic procedure, such as majority rule. However, it's not sufficient for a decision to count as democratic that it be made following a democratic procedure. For instance, by representatives elected in free and fair elections or by a referendum, since such a decision is not immune from criticisms based on democratic reasons. Let me explain. If a decision undermines or weakens the preconditions for making democratic decisions in the future, the decision cannot be called democratic. For instance, to take an uncontroversial example, a decision to disenfranchise a large portion of the population cannot be called democratic, even if it was agreed to by the majority. Thus, not all decisions made in a referendum are democratic. If a decision undermines future possibilities of democracy, such as prohibiting freedom of speech would, then it can be criticized on democratic grounds. If this is correct, we must ask ourselves what future consequences for democracy Catalan's independence would have. For example, does it serve the cause of democracy to say that each ethnos should have their own state? In a globalized, independent world, is the quest for national self-determination the best thing that can happen for democracy, for pluralism, and for the protection of minority rights? I leave those questions open for you to reflect upon, but I want to emphasize that every nationalist and secessionist has a responsibility to consider the consequences of his or her claim, not only for him or herself, but for all peoples and all human beings, and for the future of democracy. Let me finally turn to the issue of political compromise. Above, I mentioned majority rule as a possible democratic principle and procedure. However, the will of the majority is only the will of the majority and not the will of the people, of the whole people. And we still have the problem of which people or demons should decide. The problem with majority rule is that winner takes all, and the minority gets nothing. And this is, of course, important also in Catalonia, where the vote is very evenly divided. I also suggested that a Catalan case is one about which there's reasonable disagreement. People committed to human rights and democracy are found on both sides of the conflict. For these reasons, it seems reasonable to consider further the possibilities of compromise. We should not compromise on everything. That is, for example, there should be no compromise on racial equality. So I don't think that compromise is something you should do with any and all positions. But when the disagreements are reasonable, compromise is an option. A compromise is a form of disagreement in which all sides make concessions in order to be able to live together, and in which the concessions are motivated by the presence of disagreement. That is to say, when you compromise not merely for strategic reasons, but for moral reasons, you do so because the other party disagrees with you, and that you cannot reach a consensus. So note the following about compromise. When a compromise is not merely strategic, but moral, it's based on a fundamental norm of mutual respect. When we accept to compromise, we do so because we accept the other party's dignity and equality. Compromise is not consensus. When parties compromise, it's because they cannot convince each other of which answer is the right one. Thus, compromise requires that one is willing to live with disagreement, to live with a solution which is no one's first choice or preference. This is oftentimes necessary when you have reasonable disagreements. You have to live under conditions with which you are not fully satisfied because you respect your opponent's right to disagree. Compromises are particularly difficult in cases in which identity is at issue. Identity claims concerns who we are, and this tends to be an all-or-nothing matter. The politics of compromise is easier when claims are couched in terms of values and interest, because we hold values and we possess interests, whereas that around which we construct our identities constitute who we are. Attacks upon my values and interests will thus be perceived less as attacks upon who I am than will attacks upon my very identity. Identity arguments are dangerous to democracy because they make compromise less likely than argument couched in terms of values and interests. Thus, if we want democracy to work, we should avoid identity claims and argue about interest and values. I'm deeply concerned that the appeal to identity in many current political movements lead to polarization and undermines dialogue and the possibility of compromise. This form of uncompromising identity politics is evident in populist politics. I worry that nationalist secession movements will only contribute to the idea that politics is about irreconcilable identities rather than negotiable interests and values. In September last year, before the referendum, Mr. Puigdemont wrote in The Guardian, "No longer will we compromise on our desire for a referendum. We won't give up on it." I would like to end by asking Mr. Puigdemont if he sees any value and any possibility of compromise, not only with the Spanish government, but also with the Catalans who are against independence, of whom there are many.
After the intervention of the lady. Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, for your thoughts. Your concept of the reasonable disagreements, I like it. Because we try to find a framework when our reasonable disagreements could help us to find a solution. But the problem is, what kind of compromise, what kind of discourse is possible if the other sides in this conflict don't recognize the other part's dignity? Because of course, all the people in Catalonia or in Spain has the right to say all the things. Well, to propose, to vote whole Spain about Catalan independence. No one has proposed it in any table of negotiation, this kind of solution, but it could be a solution, or it could be a proposal that we can listen or study. But what kind of compromise is possible if the other part of the problem is continuous denying the reality that, in fact, there is more than 2 million people that in Catalonia voted for independence. Probably the majority of the Spanish people say this is not correct, this is not the solution, but that exists. And it's not an expression for a day. We are organizing huge mobilizations from 2012. Every year, more than 1 million people took the streets peacefully, demanding vote to decide. To decide what? I think we can find an agreement about what we can decide together. And always, I as a president and the rest of my colleagues are inviting permanently not only the Spanish representative, but also the society in general, to discuss about how we can solve politically this problem. And what's the answer from the Spanish state? It's not a political proposal. is not a framework of reasonable disagreements. No, no, it's jail. How it's possible I could win the election with a program saying, if we win the elections, we will propose a referendum on independence, and this idea, democratically accepted by the Spanish authorities, is proposed and voted for the people. The same ideas that could bring to you, to transfer to you in a president, are the same ideas that could send to you in a prison. There is a contradiction, and we must solve this kind of contradiction, talking, negotiating, to sit in the table and to recognize the problem, because there is a problem. It's a constitutional problem, it's a political problem, but it's not a penal problem, it's not a justice problem. And one of the parts of this conflict has denied always to recognize there is a political problem. Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy said to me clearly, I can't and I don't want to talk about it. So in democracy, I think the right to not discuss doesn't exist. The right to don't discuss doesn't exist. So I invite always permanently to discuss in order to find this framework of reasonable disagreements. Just a thing that is not correct in your speech. The Vall d'Aran has the right to decide, has recognized by law, by Catalan law, approved by the unanimously, the right to decide their own future, because we consider the Vall d'Aran a nation. So we have no problem with the idea that one day, a majority of people who see themselves as a nation could act as a nation, because it's not something sacred, it's not something coming from the God. With the borders, it's possible to move. It's not a drama. Why is a drama to move the borders? Why? I think the way to discuss these kind of issues is, of course, dialogue, and to respect the other part. But one part of this conflict is in jail, another no. So we demand only not to accept our point of view, which is not identity, which is not based in identity, because Catalonia is a nation based from more identities, languages, cultures, point of views. But I demand only the respect for our point of view, and to talk with the Catalans who don't want to be independent, how we can have the tools and the resources to build a better country. And with the tools and the resources inside the Spanish state, that is not possible after more than 30 years trying to find an agreement with Spain.
Christian, do you want to... Mr. Puigdemont, may I ask you a question which was implied in one of Professor Rosbell's remarks? Are you a populist?
Sorry?
Are you a populist?
No.
No.
Why?
Why? No, but I mean, if you are, let me make the case for that. You are arguing in terms of national identity. You are mobilizing the people, millions in the street. I mean, that would live up to many people's definition of populism.
Well, I think I not has talk about national identity. Of course, Catalonia is a nation. It's come from the history. But I talk about non-violence, for example. I talk about dialogue. I talk about negotiation. I talk to recognize the other, to find an agreement. I'm afraid that is not define a populist. What's a populist? Who something was not in the line that the Populist Party want, or the European institutions, not the European society. The European institutions expect to make politics. Well, I think I'm completely disagree with this idea. Of course, there exists populism, but we are happy in Catalonia to express our will with the the tools of democracy, the people has mobilized for independence. If you look at the Catalan people who is supporting the independence, we look people from the right or the left, poor, rich, young, old. So the diversity of Catalonia, I think it's so it's so hard for us to listen some people who not know deeply the Catalan reality, or only by Spanish media, to say that happening in Catalonia is a classic expression of populism. I think nothing to do with populism. It's only with democracy, or part of democracy. Of course, the democracy is not only to listen to the people, of course, I agree with you. But it's part important of the democracy. It's possible to make decisions for all the country without asking the people? No. Well, from my point of view, no. So that is a part, a very important part of democracy. It is not populism. We are not populist, but of course, the people have the right to say we are populist.
But I think the point Christian made was that the definition of the people is rather important here, right? The people who should decide the future of Catalonia, is how is that defined? Is that defined as the present Spanish state? Is that defined as Catalonia? Is that defined as whomever might have been living there for a certain amount of time, and so on and so forth? Many places in the world you will have this disagreement on who actually constitute the people. But from your perspective, that is a rather simple question which is easily answered.
No, nothing in our case is easily to answer. No, if you try to look the Catalan situation with the glasses very simple, we can find the explanation. It's not possible to understand nothing, because it's a very complicated situation. For example, why 10 years ago, not 10 years, 8 years ago, or 6 years ago, in the Catalan parliament was only 14 members elected from pro-independence parties. And then, after 2 or 3 years, were 72. Why? Is nothing asking himself what's happening in Catalonia could explain this change, the deep change? It's not possible to explain with a single answer and a single regard. You need to understand a lot of situations, also Spanish constitutional situations, to understand why this Catalan society has produced this very important change of the look towards our future. So it's not easy to answer your question, but don't forget, please, we only want to agree a question to decide in the ballot boxes, like Scotland has do, or Quebec, or other countries. Is there other way to solve this problem that negotiating and finally voting? I don't see another way. We try to find this problem.
So speaking about compromise, if we imagine a future where the Spanish government would sanction a referendum in Catalonia, it was completely fair, you had all the influence on the question you wanted, but still a majority, for whatever reason, voted to remain in Spain, then you would say, fine?
Okay, of course. And if you read my last speech in Madrid in April, I think May or April last year, you can read exactly your words. We propose to the Spanish government an agreement based on the date of referendum. Why we need to hold a referendum this year? Why not, for example, 5 years ahead? About the question, it's only the question about independence, the only possible question? No, we are disposed to discuss about it. About the majority we need in order to proclaim independence. It's enough 31%, or we need more? And finally, we propose to find an agreement for a generation. Because if you lose the referendum, we must accept the results, and our compromise will be not propose every 3 years or every 4 years a referendum. And we was disposal to find an agreement for a generation.
Thank you. You were talking about complex issues, and I have one of my best experts on the most complex issues of all, which is the European Union. Marlene Wind, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The EU may be complex, but it's not as perhaps theoretical as the very distinguished speech by Christian Rosbøl. Thank you very much for being here. And I want to stress that I'm not an expert on internal affairs of Spain. Mm-hmm. I'm an expert on the EU, but I'm also an expert on democracy, maybe a little bit more hands-on than what we just heard. But I think we agree a lot. We didn't coordinate anything, I can assure you. But I have designed my intervention like a set of questions. So if you have your pen ready to take notes. That's what I always tell my students. So,
this is an interview.
It's an interview, yes. Yeah. I would say that normally I don't have that many students in my class, but it's nice to see so many. But I would also like actually to start with democracy, and then maybe make the question a bit more direct, in the sense of asking how you define it. You're not allowed to answer until I'm done. So just. How you define democracy. Is it only, referenda and opinion polls and voting, or is it also the rule of law and the constitution? Because what I have understood from following the debate in Spain, and now I do interfere a little bit in the Spanish situation, and forgive me for that, I know there's a lot of Catalans here, independence people. I was wondering, to my knowledge, you have voted for the constitution, the Spanish constitution in Catalonia. And should that constitution not also be respected? Is that not also democracy? So that would be my first question. And the second one in relation to that is the fact that only 43% showed up to vote for independence. Does that not have an impact on the legitimacy of that vote to you? I would like to hear your opinion on that. I know that was a big majority voting for independence, but the fact that a minority showed up, it does stress what Christian also said about the unionists, the ones wanting to stay in Spain, that they are perhaps not being heard so much. What you also hear from the situation in Catalonia, which is a wonderful place, by the way, I think all Danes, and thank you for all the praise for Denmark, is that a lot of them have been afraid to take part in the debate about the issue, and have been feeling that they were the silent minority. I think we can agree that 50-50 is the division in Catalonia at the moment in terms of wanting to leave Spain and not. So I would like your reflections on that. What is democracy? Isn't it also the Constitution? And should the Constitution not be respected? I think that's also one of the reasons why a lot of people have said that this is an internal Spanish matter. I'll get back to that. What we are seeing today is a situation where approximately half of the Catalonians, and I do not want to go into percentages about how many voted for or against. I know it's a very narrow majority you have in the parliament right now. But the fact that only a very narrow majority wants to go in this direction, is that not problematic? when it comes to securing the rights of those who do not want independence. And also, if I may be a little bit provocative, are your style and the way you have conducted this whole process not contributing to polarizing the Spanish society and the Catalonian discussion? You say you want to negotiate with Rajoy and the government, but the whole style of rushing into a referendum, declaring it on the same day, where half of the parliament leaves and boycotts it, is that not, in your opinion, also a very provocative move that may contribute to escalating the whole discussion? So that kind of questions, I think, are important to confront. I also think that we in Denmark are a bit puzzled, and I think in many parts of Europe are a bit puzzled about whether what you are really going for is still independence. Do you stick to what you said on the 1st of October when you declared that? But also, what is this urge for independence? Where does it come from? To my knowledge, Catalonia is the richest region in Spain. Are you just spoiled? wanting to get rid of all the poor? And also, to my knowledge, the kind of decentralized regime you have in Spain is more decentralized than the federal state of Germany. But you may not agree to that, of course. We can get back to that. So moving to Europe, I would actually like to hear your vision of the European Union. You said a lot of interesting things in your intervention about the EU. On the one hand, you blame the EU for siding with Rajoy. I understand that, of course, from your perspective. But on the other hand, you also say that you are very much in favor of the European Union and the whole European project, and that you're hoping that you'll have support and more support in the future. But if we take our point of departure in what you were actually saying earlier about independence, what are you envisioning about the European integration process? Is it a Balkanization that is your ideal? What do I mean by that? I actually mean the same as what Christian, my colleague, suggested about ethnic cleaned states. Hundreds of them working together. Is that your ideal? I'm sorry I'm provoking, but that's why I'm here, right? Is that your vision, that we should break up Europe in hundreds, 200 states? How much do you want? That are all clean in the sense of having only one identity? Is that what you want? Is that what you're striving for? And if it is, I'm very worried, and I understand that I'm very worried, and I understand that the European Union is really, really nervous about your mission. It does call back memories. Well, the reason why I use Balkanization is, of course, that the only way we could solve the crisis of ex-Yugoslavia was to, build states that were clean. I think it's a very dangerous way to move. I think it was a big failure, even though it was the only solution at the time. And is that what we want in the 21st century? Is that to have small states that are based only on one language and one ethnicity, identity, whatever you want to call it? Is that your perspective? And what about stability? Are you reflecting about at all when you go to sleep at night? Maybe you have some more interesting stuff to think about, but are you ever thinking about how instability might be the effect of your project in terms of inspiring other regions in Europe to do the same? and a domino effect that will end up undermining the EU. There's lots of people out there who are inspired by what you're doing. Are you happy about that, or are you nervous about that? Could like to hear your comment. And who actually benefits from more independent states in Europe? Well, I think a lot of people in here would agree with me that Vladimir Putin would certainly be happy if that was to be the case. Breaking Europe up, having hundreds of small entities, nobody could agree on anything. I don't know if that is also too provoking for you to answer. I'm afraid of the crowd starting to scream soon. Do you expect Catalonia in the future to become a member of the EU? Is that your expectation? Is that your hope? I think it's your hope, but do you think it will happen? Considering that Catalonia has been pretty alone in its fight for independence. And of course you blame Rajoy and you blame Spain. But to be quite frank, also tomorrow I know that very few Danish politicians from the government want to meet you. A lot of people are afraid of sort of pushing in this direction. What are your reflections on that? Not being sort of embraced by a lot of European leaders. The fact that you need unanimity to vote a new country into the European Union, do you think it would ever happen that Spain would vote for Catalonia to become a member of the European Union? Your comments on that? And then just finally, your point about comparing Spain and what's going on in Spain with Poland and Hungary. In my opinion, that's almost offensive. I think what's happening in Poland and Hungary is really, really scary in terms of not living up to the basic principles of the EU and what they committed themselves to in terms of democracy, rule of law. In Spain, there's a constitution, it's a democracy. I certainly think, and I'm not saying everything is great, and I also think that imprisoning people for 30 years is a disgrace and something you shouldn't do. I think a smaller sentence could be probably more appropriate. I won't comment on that. But also, things are not black and white. And I also, I'm completely convinced that also in the EU, that is a general opinion that we should compromise, we should talk, we should discuss, and that's the only way forward to make ends meet among those who really want to stay in Spain and those who want to be independent. But Poland and Hungary, I don't think they can be compared. To my knowledge, despite the fact that you can always criticize the way that the government has been handling the situation in Catalonia recently, I still haven't seen any kind of documentation from independent lawyers, the Venice Commission or the Council of Europe, that Spain is not a democracy. So I think there is a difference. I think that should be respected. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Malene. And Mr. Puigdemont, I'm sure that you can be enrolled in one of Malene's classes if you really want to take her exams. but it is all yours.
Okay. Well, you start your intervention saying you are not an expert in Spanish international affairs. I agree. I agree with you.
That's all right.
Of course, if you look the papers, yes, you are right. Spanish is a democracy. If you look the papers, but I think you must look the facts, the reality, because you know in the last elections, curiously, the Spanish authorities has prohibited a banner saying only democracy. That shows a very engaged state to democratic values. What kind of problem has the Spanish state, this exemplary democracy, with the word democracy? Why? Why is prohibited? That is the fact. Is any law in Spain saying it's not possible to write democracy? No, of course not. But what's the reality? It's prohibited. So it's full of these examples in Spain, and I invite you to know more deeply the reality. The reality, because probably some of your sentence will be a little different. I will try to answer all of the questions. I think, I'm afraid
it's not an exam, though.
An exam, but well.
We might give marks in the end, so do your best.
Of course, you are right. The democracy is not only a matter of referendums. It's both. The rule of law, democracy is the rule of law, the referendum, the participation, and changing, and possibility to change. Because the rule of law is not made by iron. You need to adapt for every generation, because the generation of your students, their needs are different of ours. And it could be not possible to change more of this kind of rule of law if they are not more flexible, more adaptive to the reality. We try this. We are, of course, committed to the rule of law. My question is a respect to rule of law when the Spanish state has changed the procedure to reform our constitution of autonomy? Because in the constitution that we voted, well, I'm not, because I was not with the age to vote, but of course, in 77, 78, we voted the Spanish constitution. In this constitution, they say the only way to reform the Statute of Autonomy, like Catalonia has, is to write and approve a project in the Catalan parliament, to send this project to the Spanish parliament, and once it's approved, to hold a referendum in Catalonia, and the people must approve it. Finish. Well, it's not the case in our current Statute of Autonomy, because our current Statute of Autonomy has not voted for the people. And we must follow a text that only no one Catalan has voted. This is the respect of law. If you look the Constitution, of course, it's clear. But if you look the reality, there's so many differences. I'm not agree with the idea that Spain are more decentralized than Germany, because the results of the 10 last years, or 18 last years since the majority absolute of José María Aznar, is, yes, a devolved state in the papers, but a very, very centralized state in the reality. Because for my government, for example, it's not possible to open the commercial delegation outside the Catalonia, but it's possible for example, Andalusia. There is no problem, but we have a problem. Why? If you are the most decentralized state in Europe. Why? Well, because the Spanish state is thinking probably you will use these delegations for make the propaganda. And without proof, they say you have no right to open, despite, if you look the text, if you look the Constitution, if you look the Statute of Autonomy, they say clearly you have the right to open, to make international activity in matters of like commerce or economic promotion. So, you talk about the number of people that we need in order to consider legitimate a decision. I'm agree of this, of course. If the Catalan society is divided, and if you need or no, or is better independent state or not, well, the same figures I can use the same figures to say the opposite. Is enough 50% of the population to remain in Spain? Because if not enough to declare independence, why is enough to remain in Spain? So of course, there is a conflict, and we must to solve. But I'm afraid in Spain it's not a matter of figures, because in the past elections, these elections, others elections, and the 3 elections ago, the majority of the people, a huge majority, more than 60%, has voted in favor of a calling referendum.
Of calling the referendum.
With an agreement to a Spanish state. It's not enough to have a majority in the ballot boxes, a huge majority for the Spanish state, not to accept our proposal, no, to start a discuss. It's only our demand to the Spanish state is not to say yes to our referendum, to start to discuss, to recognize the reality has changed from the era when we approved the Spanish Constitution. No one in Catalonia is demanding autonomy. But in '77 was the majority of Catalan people demanding autonomy. Now we demand other relationship with Spain. I think I don't want to talk about Vladimir Putin. I don't know. Probably you have read some fake news that consider me as a Russian spion called Cipollino or with links with the mafia, the Russian mafia. I'm sorry, but it's not a matter of academic. It's a matter for the media without serious, without professionality. But if you want to talk seriously about Catalonia, Russia is not on the table. I know that a lot of digital papers in Spain has published the supposed relationship between Catalonia and Russia. Please, more seriously. It's a joke. The joke is okay, but I invite all of you to come to Catalonia, to enter in the Catalan government, to demand everything free. And if you look, one thing that you could permit to say that we are linked to Russia or, I don't know, Venezuela or Korea del Norte, well, okay, you are free to speak, but without proof, please. I think it's not...
But it's more the instability that independence...
I want to talk about instability, my style of polarizing Catalan society, provocative. I'm not provocative. I'm a journalist. I have a style to communicate directly. But if you look all of my speeches, all my conferences, my interviews, you will see an engagement with the peace, with the non-violence, with respect to the other, of course, to respect the other part of the Catalonia that don't want independence, and of course in the frame of the European Union and the European Union values. Because the European Union is not only the institutions, it's the values. It's a chart of fundamental rights, for example. Because it's a commitment for the majority of the countries. It's not correct to take only the part of the European Union more strong and to let the part most complicated. Because if the European Union is only a syndicate of states, I think that must be to say to the people. Because the people like me, we hope in the European Union. We hope at still level, for me, from the majority of the Catalan people, there is no problem what is saying in our national identity document. We are ready to accept a European United States of Europe. There is no problem. It's not a matter of identity, our claim. So for this, it's offensive for us, this theory of Balkanization of Europe. Because if you look the history of our movement, the political Catalanism, you will see always long time, our commitment to peace. So for us, Europe is our house. We feel deeply European. So there is no other option for us to contribute to develop Europe. What Europe? And that has a relation with what kind of relations we want to have with the international institutions. Well, as an autonomous community, we are leaders in Spain and part of Europe, for example, signing the Paris Agreement against climate change. We are one of the most important actors in the Paris Agreement. We are disposal to establish in Catalonia the refugees that is dying in the Mediterranean Sea. We want to talk about all the world, how we can contribute to solve the problems around the world. So we think with a very solidarity nation. There is no project, our project is no project to close ourselves inside our borders. Borders are not any interest for us. Borders are not interest. The tools are interest. The resources are interest. But the borders, the papers, the flags, is not. We don't discuss about borders, flags, papers. We discuss about tools and resources and how we can contribute to a better developed world. This is our discussion in Catalonia. Well, Anna, I think you make me a journalistic question about the situation in Catalonia that has not a relationship with the issue that we are discussing today. And if you don't mind, I don't want to answer your question. No, I will explain why. Because I think we have a very, very interesting debate. And controversial, but very interesting. And I will want to thank you, your things and your words. And if I say something about the news in Catalonia in relationship with the decision of the parliament or the decision of the Spanish justice, I think nothing of we are talked will appear in the media. And I think for respect for the university and the students and the teacher, I prefer, tomorrow I convoked no press conference, a concentration of media in face of the parliament. I will say something about this. And if you don't mind, I prefer to stay in the framework of our discussion for respect of the rest of the people. And your question about the Basque Country and Galicia and other parts, well, it's very different because, you know, the Basque Country, like Navarra, in difference with Catalonia, has the right to collect their own taxes. And this makes a significant difference between us. Because, in fact, they collect the taxes and then they will negotiate, they must negotiate to Spanish state what amount they must to pay for the general services. Of course, this is not a very bad situation, but I think for this reason, I think that our process has not directly consequences in other parts of Spain. Maybe in other parts of Europe, because our way, our demands are completely different from other national cases in Europe. There's no link with Scotland, with Flanders, with the north of Italy, with the Corsica, no. Of course, we invoke the right of self-determination, but the relation with the state or the reality of our society are completely different. For this reason, this idea, the domino effect of our case, I think is excused, is not the reality, the real problem. That will happen. Because if we find our way through the European tools, like talks, negotiate, agreements, well, we are exactly make more strong the European Union, more ready to face the future crisis. Crisis. Look at what President Macron has do with Corsica elections. They has do something that Mariano Rajoy has never do. Call and to start to dialogue with the people who has won the elections in Corsica. And I think if the Catalonia or France or Spanish state act like this, it's not a threat against Europe. That makes more stronger Europe. And for this reason, I'm not afraid a domino effect, the Catalan case in the rest of the Spanish regions or in European regions.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
And thank you to the entire panel, to Professor Christian Rosbøl, Professor Marlene Wind, and of course to you, Charles Puigdemont, for contributing to what I find to be a lively, sometimes even sharp, but always friendly debate this afternoon. Thank you so much all for coming. A little point of order. All of you who have nice, comfy, soft seats, stay in them. All of you who are sitting on the cold ground, get up and move very slowly and carefully out in the cold night. Thank you.
Has tret el tall del referèndum?